Good afternoon, morning, or evening. Here we are at week 14 of our reading in the Chronological Bible. April 2nd through April 8th is the week. And we're basically reading from 1 Samuel 21 through 2 Samuel 5 in round numbers. And now that we are reading in David's time, our editor, F. LaGard Smith, has thrown some psalms in for our enjoyment, written by David, and he has distributed them in the text at points where his understanding is that they would have been written at that point in time. Obviously, this is Mr. Smith's interpretation of the time, so we don't need to get too wound up about whether they belong there or not. I've just been reading them as they come in the text we have. And note that our reading begins with David's flight from Saul. So when David was a youth, he killed Goliath, and Saul began loving the fact that he was there and could play the harp and all that. And David goes to Jonathan, his very good friend, and specifically asks, "Why is Saul trying to kill me?" And Jonathan asserts his father would not do such a thing. He would certainly tell his own son if he was planning to kill David. Well, very shortly after that conversation, Jonathan confirms that Saul wants David dead and intends to make it happen if he can. And this is where that interesting story, it's a puzzling story, where they have the secret code where if he tells the young lad to go fetch the arrow beyond where he's standing, that means one thing. If he tells him it's back toward Jonathan, that means a different thing. And they execute that plan. But oddly enough, afterwards, they talk. And that's pretty much the last time David gets to talk to Jonathan, if I'm not mistaken. So at that point, David flees to the Philistines, and there he pretends to be a raving lunatic. Now, I don't understand that exactly. He didn't want Achish, the king of the Philistines, to be threatened by him, I guess, that thinking, well, he'll try to kill me if he knows that I'm the same David who killed his thousands, or tens of thousands, actually, they said. So what can I say? I don't know. That's what he did. But ultimately, David and 400 of his followers flee to a cave, the cave of Adullam. And the most troubling story to me in this whole passage, well, there are plenty of troubling stories, but the most troubling to me is this one where, as he was fleeing, David snagged from the priests, he snagged the bread of the presence and Goliath's sword from Ahimelech at Nob. Now, a couple of commentators claim, not F. LaGard Smith makes no claim about this, but a couple of commentators I've read assert that the tabernacle was at Nob at this point. I don't personally think the text supports that, but maybe, I don't know. But for sure, they were doing the offerings at this point. I think the Ark of the Covenant is still at Obed-Edom's home, or it's been recovered from the time it was captured by the Philistines, excuse me. But anyway, so a guy named Doeg was there when Ahimelech gave David and his followers bread and Goliath's sword. And he promptly scampered back to Saul and reported this story to Saul. And so Saul has Ahimelech brought to the palace, wherever that is. I don't think there's a big palace in Jerusalem yet. I'm pretty sure of that. He has Ahimelech brought into his presence. He asked him if this happened. Ahimelech basically said, well, Your Honor, we often did work for David at your direction. He came to us telling us that we should do that, and we did. And Saul said, off with their heads. No, he didn't say off with their heads, but he literally told the guards to kill them, to kill all of the priests, and the guards refused. They said, I'm not going to kill the Lord's priests. And so Doeg himself killed 85 priests, and then all the people of Nob were killed, which is a small village not too far from Jerusalem. So that, to me, is probably the most troubling story in our current reading. So in any event, David's and his small band of followers head for the crags of the wild goats. Now, again, I don't know exactly where that is. I'm convinced it's in the desert of the Negev, which is kind of a desolate area south of the Dead Sea. And once again, David and his men are hiding in a cave, different cave now. Saul's on the prowl, trying to find David. He wants to get rid of this troublemaker because by now he understands that his kingship is going to be terminated and replaced by David. And the only solution Saul can see to that problem is to kill David so he can't be replaced by David. So Saul and his troops are out scouting around trying to find David. Saul enters the cave where David and his men are hiding. Now, this must be a fairly large place if he still has 400 blokes with him. Nonetheless, Saul enters the cave to relieve himself, so he's going to use the toilet there. And while he's doing that, so, we could draw some conclusions about what he was doing, but while he's doing that, David manages to incise a chunk off of his cloak. And then Saul exits the cave, and he's with his boys, his hands. And at that point, David reveals himself, and he says, look, I could have easily killed you. It would have been simple. Here's a piece of your garment. The same knife that I used to cut that off, I could have killed you, but I didn't. I am not going to try to kill you. You are the Lord's anointed. And Saul acknowledges that he is in the wrong, that he will not continue to pursue him, and they leave. That is to say, Saul and his boys. But nonetheless, David continues to hide out because he doesn't trust that claim. And just so you know, it's about this time that Samuel dies. Sometime later, now remember, there's a famous story that's in this section where Abigail, Nabal's wife, talks David out of killing Nabal because he's such a bonehead. Anyway, so he's died of natural causes, and David has thanked her for stopping him from engaging in such murder. And then David married Abigail. So now he's got a slightly bigger band of hands with him. And once again, naturally, Saul is out on the hunt trying to find David. So David and Abishai, that's one of the 30 that ultimately are the leaders of the army, they crept into Saul's camp in the desert of Ziph. Now, that's, again, I can only say that that's down near the Negev. I do not know exactly where. And David swiped Saul's spear and his water jug. So then, once again, David reveals himself to Saul and the encamped folks and says, look, you guys should be taking care of your king. This is the Lord's anointed. Look at this. You've let me take his spear and his water jug. What were you thinking? And once again, Saul apologizes for stalking him and goes on his way. So once again, David and supporters this time, now they go to Achish, the Philistine, and they are allowed to settle, if you will, in Ziklag. And they, of course, have to convince Achish that they're worth not destroying. So they go raiding down into the Sinai Peninsula, Egyptians mostly, I would say. They're raiding the Egyptians. They kill every time they raid a community, they kill everybody. So there's nobody to report who did this. And they offer some of the spoils to Achish. So that's their method of surviving. Well, then Achish says that he's going to involve David in fighting with the Israelites. This is a bad situation, but I would say by the grace of God, the leaders, the other leaders of the Philistines say to Achish, we don't want that Israelite on our side. He's sure to turn against us. So at that point, Achish tells him, go home. We don't want you to help us with the Israelites. And so by the grace of God, he does not become obligated to engage in warfare against the Israelites. And it's at this time that some of the peoples of the Sinai Peninsula and or the Arabian Peninsula, I can't tell for sure, attack Ziklag, steal their goods, but David and his men all recover all that, and that's when the concept is started that those who stay behind share in the spoils, not just those who go to fight. So at any rate, Saul and Jonathan end up dying in battle with the Philistines. So they're both dead. And after a bit of a civil war, there were many who said, no, we shouldn't have David as a king. He was fleeing from Saul. So at that point, David finally does become the king, and that's in our reading on April 7th at 2 Samuel 2:11. I'll read that very brief passage. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. So his reign over Israel was 40 years in Hebron, where he's reigning initially, because many of the tribes have not acknowledged him as king yet. He reigned in Hebron for 7 years and 6 months, and then in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So that's where we are in our reading. And now, finally, once he becomes king, David finally does capture Jerusalem. Now remember, that was in the list of communities they had not captured. And he tries to have the ark moved from Abinadab's house using a cart to get it from Kiriath Jearim to the Obed-Edom's home. Now, his plan was to bring it to Jerusalem, but when Uzzah died because they were moving the ark on a cart, which is against the rules, it's supposed to be carried on the 2 poles by 4 priests. So when Uzzah reaches up to steady the cart, because he touches the ark and he dies, poof, immediately for violating the ark, because only a priest can touch it. So they abandon the ark. That's not the right word, but they leave the ark with Obed-Edom. And so we're fairly sure that at that point, it's at Obed-Edom's home. And finally, within our reading, after an interval of unknown duration, to me anyway, the ark is carried properly by the Levites into Jerusalem, and the ark finds its home in Jerusalem. It's not clearly stated, but I believe at that point the tabernacle either was moved from or rebuilt from the place where it was in Shiloh years before. So that's where we are. David is now the king, and the kingdom will soon be the largest it will be until Solomon's time. So David is currently reigning over kind of a subset of the whole, it's all the areas of Israel, but he will soon have control over all the areas of Israel. So with that, we close for the week, and you will carry on your reading on April 9th. Thank you for joining us.